Few words spoken by Jesus cause as much discomfort as these. They do not wound the ears, but they confront the heart. They are words that many repeat, few understand, and almost no one truly wants to face. Because they do not speak of visible blessings, they do not promise spiritual shortcuts, and they do not feed the religious ego. On the contrary, they expose who truly governs life when no one is watching. Perhaps you have heard this call countless times. Perhaps you even agreed with it at some point. But there is a profound difference between hearing and allowing these words to pass through us. Jesus never called people merely to admire him. He called people to follow him, and that call has always had a cost. We live in a time when faith has been shaped to be comfortable. A faith that fits into routine, that does not confront choices, that does not require surrender. But the gospel was never about comfort. It has always been about transformation. And transformation begins when something within us needs to die so that something greater may live. Today, this reflection is not for those seeking a light message. It is for those who feel that something is misaligned in their heart. For those who realize they follow Jesus, but still try to maintain control. For those who desire more of God, but struggle to let go of themselves. Perhaps you will discover that the call of Jesus is not a symbolic invitation, but a real process of redefining identity. A silent, deep, and often lonely path. If you allow it, this message may reveal not only what needs to be abandoned, but who you are becoming along the way. Take a deep breath. Listen with your heart, because some words are not meant to be merely heard. They are meant to be lived. When Jesus speaks about denying oneself, he is not addressing an isolated behavior, nor an external adjustment in the way of living. He is touching the center of identity. To deny oneself is to recognize that the self can no longer occupy the throne of the heart. It is to admit that personal desires, plans, and will cannot govern life above the will of God. This call was given in a context where many followed Jesus out of admiration, curiosity, or expectation of benefits. There were miracles, authority, and words that captivated. But Jesus knew that not everyone was willing to pay the price of discipleship. For this reason, he does not soften the invitation. He makes it clear that following him requires a complete reorganization of priorities. Denying oneself is not self-annihilation, nor despising one's own existence. It is relinquishing the right to be one's own Lord. It is allowing God to redefine what has value, what guides decisions, and what sustains faith when enthusiasm fades. The call of Jesus directly confronts the culture of comfort, a culture that teaches the preservation of the ego, the satisfaction of desires, and the avoidance of any kind of loss. Within this context, denying oneself sounds almost offensive, because it moves in the opposite direction of what we have learned to pursue. Jesus does not call us to protect the self. He calls us to surrender it. Many desire the benefits of faith, but resist the process it requires. They want peace without surrender, purpose without renunciation, transformation without inner change. They attempt to follow Jesus without allowing him to disrupt what was built on control, pride, and self-sufficiency. But the gospel does not function as a complement to life. It demands a new center. It is at this point that faith ceases to be superficial. When we are confronted, not to be rejected, but to be realigned. Because what is not surrendered continues to govern, even when we use the name of God. Denying oneself is not a decision made only once. It is a daily, silent, and continuous process. It does not occur in an isolated moment of emotion, but in the repeated choices we make when no one is watching. It is in everyday life that the ego attempts to regain control, demanding recognition, validation, and security. Dying to oneself involves confronting habits, thoughts, and desires that for a long time defined who we are. It involves letting go of the need to always be right, to be understood, to control outcomes. This process is painful because it disturbs internal structures that gave us identity for years. But it is precisely within this pain that faith matures. The disciples also went through this learning process. At the beginning, they still competed for positions, recognition, and proximity. Gradually, they understood that following Jesus meant allowing old versions of themselves to die, not to lose identity, but to find a new identity shaped by obedience. When the self diminishes, something changes deeply. Reactions become more conscious. Choices cease to be impulsive. The heart becomes more sensitive to God's direction. This inner death is not the end. It is the beginning of a life led by the Spirit, and no longer by the ego. After speaking about denying oneself, Jesus takes the call to an even deeper point: taking up the cross. This is not a symbolic or comfortable image. In the time of Jesus, the cross represented death, public shame, and total loss of control. By using this image, he makes it clear that discipleship involves visible choices and real commitment. Taking up the cross is not an isolated event. It is a continuous posture. It is accepting that following Jesus implies relinquishing expectations, personal rights, and the need for self-preservation. The cross exposes what we prefer to hide. It places us in a position of dependence, where there is no space for the ego to govern. This point separates admirers from disciples. Many are moved by the words of Jesus, but retreat when they realize the path involves renunciation. The cross deconstructs the idea of a kingdom based on human recognition. It reveals that God's way is not built by force, but by surrender. Carrying the cross also means remaining faithful when there is no applause, when obedience goes unnoticed, when following Jesus demands silence, loss, and misunderstanding. It is in this place that faith becomes genuine, not because it is seen, but because it is lived. Taking up the cross is not limited to great decisions or extreme moments. It manifests in daily choices that require the renunciation of the ego. It is present when we choose forgiveness instead of withdrawal, when we remain faithful without immediate return, when we serve without recognition. The cross is revealed in love practiced in silence. Jesus never presented the cross as something comfortable. He knew that loving as he loved would have a cost. Loving requires letting go of wounded pride, the need for retaliation, and the desire for self-preservation. Often, the easiest path is to give up, but the cross calls us to remain. There is a constant attempt to soften this call, turning the cross into generic life difficulties. But Jesus was speaking of something more specific: the conscious decision to die to control, self-sufficiency, and the need for approval. The cross is not merely what happens to us. It is the posture we choose to assume. When we accept this path, something is deeply transformed. Faith ceases to be mere discourse and becomes practice. Obedience becomes more valuable than comfort. And love ceases to be conditioned by circumstances, becoming the expression of a life that no longer belongs to itself, but to Christ. Faithfulness is never revealed when everything is comfortable. It manifests when the cost appears. When following Jesus requires difficult choices, real losses, and renunciations that no one applauds. It is at this point that many retreat, not due to lack of declared faith, but resistance to complete surrender. The path of the cross directly confronts performative faith, a faith that needs to be seen, validated, and recognized. Jesus points to a different faith, a silent faith, sustained by obedience and not by human approval. Many decisions made out of faithfulness to Christ go unnoticed, but they produce deep fruit in character. The apostles learned this in practice. Each one needed to deny old versions of themselves. Peter had to relinquish self-sufficiency. John learned to transform zeal into love. Paul had to die to his former identity, status, and religious certainty. Before fully living the calling, all went through an inner death. This silent faith redefines success. Success ceases to be public recognition and becomes perseverance. Remaining faithful when no one sees. Remaining obedient when there is no immediate return. Standing firm when the only confirmation comes from a conscience aligned with God. It is in this place that faith becomes mature and true. After denying oneself and accepting the cross, an inevitable question arises. Who governs the heart when no one is watching? This dispute does not occur only in major decisions, but in the small, silent, and repeated choices of daily life. It is there that it is revealed who is in control, the ego or Christ. Many believe that following Jesus means merely agreeing with his teachings. But following, in its deepest sense, is allowing him to guide the rhythm, direction, and priorities of life. This requires spiritual sensitivity, humility, and trust. The path will not always be clear, fast, or comfortable. Often, it passes through silence. Denying oneself does not mean denying emotions or personality, but learning not to be governed by them. Not every desire needs to be followed. Not every opinion needs to be defended. Not every will needs to be satisfied. This awareness only becomes possible when the self leaves the center. At this point, faith ceases to be theoretical and becomes existential. The question is no longer what I want, but who I am willing to follow. And this answer shapes the entire spiritual journey, even when no one sees. After speaking about denying oneself and taking up the cross, Jesus reveals something even deeper. There is a silent dispute happening within every heart. On one side, the desire to follow one's own will. On the other, the constant invitation to trust the will of God. This dispute is not visible to others, but it is clearly perceived within. It occurs in decisions that no one applauds, in thoughts that are never spoken, in reactions we choose to restrain or release. Often, we believe faith is about grand acts, but Jesus points to something more intimate. Who governs when no one is watching? Denying oneself means recognizing that not everything we desire leads to life. Not every desire needs to be followed. Not every opinion needs to be defended. Not every reaction needs to be expressed. This awareness does not imprison, it liberates. But it only becomes possible when the ego ceases to command. At this point, faith ceases to be discourse and becomes choice. The choice to obey even when there is not complete clarity. The choice to trust even when control feels safer. It is within this invisible dispute that spiritual maturity is born. Not in noise, but in the silence of a surrendered heart. After denying oneself and taking up the cross, Jesus makes a simple but definitive invitation. Follow me. This call is not merely an instruction. It is a relational invitation. To follow Jesus is not just to accept a set of teachings, but to walk with Him, learn from Him, and allow Him to lead every step of life. Following redefines rhythm. Urgency gives way to obedience. Human expectations lose strength before the will of God. Following redefines success. Success ceases to be conquering, appearing, or accumulating. It becomes remaining faithful, even without recognition. It becomes obeying, even when the path is silent. This call also redefines identity. Our identity ceases to be based on what we do, what we have, or what others say. It is built along the journey, in every decision where we choose trust over control. Denying oneself, taking up the cross, and following Jesus are not separate stages. They are daily choices. Perhaps today you realize that your faith needs realignment. Recognizing this is not failure. It is the beginning. Jesus does not call the ready. He calls the willing. Willing to remove the self from the center so that Christ may occupy the place that has always been His. If this message spoke to your heart, do not ignore this moment. Sometimes God does not speak loudly. He speaks deeply. Write in the comments, what do you feel you need to deny today in order to follow Jesus more deeply? Your testimony may be exactly the confirmation someone else is silently asking for. Leave your like so this message reaches more lives seeking direction, rest, and truth amid so many voices. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this call, even if they do not yet know it. And if you desire to continue walking with faith, awareness, and depth, subscribe to the Sacred Silence channel. Here, we do not seek a noisy faith, but a living, obedient, and transforming faith. Every day, we reflect on the teachings of Jesus not only to understand, but to live them. Activate the notification bell so you do not miss the next messages. Amid the noise of the world, God still speaks in silence.